years to the center.
It's good to know.
We have a good American accent.
Yeah, I know.
As you know, 3 years went by because of Corona time, so nothing was happening. Anyway, during this time, Venerable did this book, Running Toward Mystery, The Adventure of an Unconventional Life. It has been published by Penguin. So we have some copies here today. If you would like to pick up a copy and get the autograph, I think.
Or a thumbprint.
Or a thumbprint, yeah. So
You
I
have to
think you're all
multiply
very
them.
privileged. But I must say that I have gone through this book, and it was a page turner. I couldn't put it down. The first time when I met Venerable in Dharamsala, and he shared a story with me, and I said, please put it down on paper. And I was so happy when this book came out. So congratulations.
Thank you.
A little bit of introduction, though Venerable doesn't need one. But I think there are some new people around. So, Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi is one of the finest masters of our time. He is the founding director of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He received his undergraduate degree in philosophy and physics and graduate degree in comparative philosophy of religion from Harvard University. At the age of 10 years, he entered a Buddhist monastery in Rajgir, near ancient Nalanda University, and was subsequently ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is his spiritual mentor. Venerable Tenzin lectures internationally and is also the president of the Prajnapaya Foundation, a worldwide humanitarian organization. Today, Venerable is going to give us a teaching on abiding in the Four Immeasurables. So we are really looking forward to your talk today, and I hope we'll relatively be more enlightened. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as it is the tradition, we'll begin with a refuge and a brief invocation. Sangye Chide Chide Sanamla Janjo Pade Dagi Jinzo Gebe Sanamge Lola Benje Sangye Sangye Chudan Duye Sanamla Janjo Pade Dagi Jinzo Gebe Sanamge Lola Benje Sangye Sangye Chudan Duye Sanamla Janjo Pade Dagi Jinzo Gebe Sanamge Lola Benje Sangye Om Buddham Gacchami Sharanam Yavada Bodhi Mandata Gacchami Sharanam Bodhi Sattvanagata Sarvasa Diksha Sambhadan Prarthayami Kritanjalihi Damprati Pankurvantu Mohadu Prabhatinam Evam Akasha Satir Yavadayava Jagata Avnam Satir Bhuya Jagat Dukkani Nimnata Mandigosham Namasyami Yat Prasadan Mati Shubhe Kalyana Mitrang Mande Ham Yat Prasadach Vardate Namastare Ture Vire Tuttare Bhairashani Ture Sarvature Kale Swamham Karam Namamiham Ye Dharma Hetu Prabha Hetung Te Shantatagata Te Shanchanurudhe Vangvadi Maham Shramam. Good evening. It's a delight to be able to join you in person this evening. As we have learned more so in the last 3 years, we should take far less things for granted than we have. Even the assumption that we can sit together in a room looking at all the smiling faces So I'm glad to have this opportunity. And thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be back and to meet some old friends in different manifestations. Nonetheless, far more youthful looking. And then I had the good time meeting also a dear old friend, Geshe Samten, who's from Ladakh. If you're ever in Leh, you should visit the Jamyang school that he runs in Leh, and a wonderful place that he has created for young kids to flourish and thrive. So, so it's a joy to be here after so long, and the Four Immeasurables, which is the theme for this evening. It's probably not a new teaching, not a new sort of theme. But I hope that part of a monk's role is simply to repeat. Since human beings, we suffer from certain forms of admitted or unacknowledged amnesia. And so repetition helps. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, I was in Colombia in South America, where I go often because the Dalai Lama Center has a satellite base there. And there I work with some indigenous groups. So I was meeting with some leaders of this largest indigenous community in Colombia. Their land spans from between Colombia and Venezuela. And so I had to meet with them for certain peacemaking processes that I won't go into too much detail. But it's a tribe that, it's a tribe of about 500,000 people. And they still sleep on hammocks. Like they permanently just still sleep on hammocks. So my accommodation was a hammock when I got there. And it was very wonderful. And they have this ritual where they wake up every day at 2 a.m. and they discuss dreams. So you wake up at 2 a.m. and everybody's still in their hammock and they're talking to each other about what they dreamt and what the dreams were. And then in the morning, they were repeating again, and then they said, we have this tongue. They just call it the tongue, lengua, that they speak, which is not Spanish, but one of the minor indigenous languages. And then they said that, and we don't have, we resisted writing. The Spanish, when they came to colonize, they tried to teach us writing and teach us Spanish, but we resisted writing and we want to keep our language. But the way we have still continued is through oral. But we tend to repeat a lot. And then I said, oh, don't feel shy. When we were an old tradition, we repeated everything 3 times as well. So, and it is still something that continues. And there's this beauty that, some of my colleagues in neuroscience world are trying to research around the learning impact on brain when you sort of, these days people don't even want to go to class lectures that are just recorded. And I don't know if you have this phenomena here. If a lecture is 1 hour, they speed read the lecture. So they play the 1 hour lecture in a period of 20 minutes or so. And so one of the things that we are trying to sort of study is the retention level in the students after like 6 years, 7 years down the road, whether they remember what the lecture was and so on. So oral tradition, is still thriving in certain parts of the world, and I'm personally a very big fan of it. So the Four Immeasurables, when we sort of look at it, we have been reciting it almost every day as part of our daily practices. And it's one of the few things that we actually share with the Pali Canon. If you look at the Nikayas and the structuring of Brahma viharas, then you see sort of a direct overlay in some of the Mahayana explanations of it, and in the Pali Canon as well. However, in Mahayana tradition, as always, they try to spin it off slightly differently in order to, I think, force people to think a bit more about the practice itself. And so that's where I think the usefulness that Four Immeasurables is not just it's not just an aspirational set of things. It's not just about reciting it and feeling like, oh, today I did my part of, thinking about, metta, karuna, mudita, and upekha, these four bhavanas that are there. Loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. But when you look at the teachings of the Kadam masters, they tried to alter the order of the Four Immeasurables. So the idea was that, generally when we meditate and when we study or recite the Four Immeasurables, we talk about just, focusing on metta. Everybody knows metta, and karuna is, so I don't have to translate by habit, and mudita and upekha or upeksha. But what happens is that when you are in early stages doing the practice of Four Immeasurables, the mind has a very narrow scope of things, meaning that you're still thinking about individuals who are dear to you, individuals who are in your close circle, and so on. And so when you're thinking about, okay, today I'm going to cultivate loving kindness and compassion and so on, what happens in practice is that we say, here's a close group of people that I send a lot of loving kindness and compassion towards. And here's a group of people that I don't know that well, and I send them some loving kindness and some compassion. And we continue this practice, thinking that, the first three stages would be wonderful in terms of forming a deeper relationship with people who are close to us. And then when we get to equanimity, we think of equanimity oftentimes as a state of indifference, as a state where we say that, it shouldn't have any sense of pleasure, pain, ups and downs, and so on, meaning that the mind should be in equanimous state. However, the Kadam masters, and also Atisha, in his Lojong teachings, he suggested to change the order, so you put equanimity at first. Meaning that you don't start with metta, you start with upeksha or upekha. And the reason being, he said, that your mind is already biased, and your mind is already going to simply think within that framework of loving kindness and compassion, people you're close to, or people that you want to be close to, meaning that, you sometimes, you have this tendency where it's like, well, I would like to be closer to this person more, but, the chemistry is not working out very well, so let's send some loving kindness towards them. But when you cultivate upekha in the first layer, in the first stage, then what happens is that the mind is now firstly experiencing a level of equanimity where you're already pushing boundaries of these biases of what it means to be close to somebody, what it means to have people in close circles, and so on. Meaning your mind is already checking on that bias and saying that, no, this practice ought to be a practice that is slightly different from what I have been engaging in the past. So there, the first stage of equanimity is to begin by seeing that sentient beings, that they may come in different forms, in different breeds, varieties, species, and so on. But one, that they all have this potential for Buddhahood, and that Buddhahood is an equalizer. That sense of Buddhahood is an equalizer. And so, reflecting on that, one cultivates the sense of equanimity, where it starts to give this benefit of the potential to be enlightened to as many as possible. So you're already expanding your sense of who's dear to me, or what is dear to me, and for what reason, and so on. Then the second thing that happens in terms of checking your biases is that as you're meditating on equanimity, you begin to sort of override any sense of highs or lows in how you do classifications of relationships, because we human beings, we are transactional in that nature, meaning we prioritize our relationships for a variety of reasons, and in those reasons also, meaning we create these kinds of spheres of proximity within our relationships, and this person is closer than this person, and there are not always good reasons why we form those kinds of layers, but largely it is driven by different degrees of grasping, wants, needs, and so on. And so what equanimity, or the cultivation of equanimity, does at that stage is that you're able to sort of level things out in that manner and say that regardless of whether I think these relationships are important to me or not, what I'm able to look at or reflect at is what are the drivers for these relationships? What are the grasping categories, the needs, the wants for these relationships, by which I prioritize such sort of degrees of proximity. Then, when you have cultivated that first level of equanimity, and then you are now looking at metta, then now you're truly able to sort of cultivate metta and send metta to people without any distinctions, without any sense of this person is close or this person is close to me. You see, one of the things in Mahayana tradition, Acharya Chandrakirti, he suggested that we should be grateful to sentient beings. So sentient beings are the cause for our enlightenment. Meaning that if there were no sentient beings, many of the cultivations that we engage in, like the six perfections and so on, they'll be meaningless in some ways, meaning that there's no relational awareness or impact of whatever it is that we are cultivating. All things will be in vacuum. And so while we think of holy objects and holy things as important to our spiritual life, Chandrakirti reminds us that it's sentient beings who are the cause of enlightenment, and that our sense of attention and our sense of gratitude should never waver from that. And that's one of the core principles of what defines the Mahayana tradition. And it's not just some sentient beings. It's not just some chosen sentient beings that look like me, sentient beings who speak the same language. Meaning that sentient beings, the category of sentient beings is very different from tribalism in the Buddhist tradition, meaning that, again, we all favor or tend to favor individuals who are in the same social category, speak the same language, believe in the same things, and so on. But that's tribalism. That's not your affinity with sentient beings. And tribalism, again, is antithetical to cultivation of equanimity. And that's, again, something that we have to sort of remember more frequently, or be mindful of it more frequently, because oftentimes when we even cultivate the sense of 3 out of 4 immeasurables, a lot of it is directed towards our tribe. It's not to the vast ocean of sentient beings. So reminding oneself that sentient beings are the cause for enlightenment, and then again reflecting on this sense of equanimity, that sentient beings, just like me, just like you, that they too are going to sort of at different points in time either achieve enlightenment or contribute or create conditions for enlightenment of some group of people. So then cultivating equanimity there, and then moving to this aspect of metta, friendliness, and so on. And friendliness here simply implies, one is the attitude of friendliness, the sense that whoever I greet, I greet them as if I have had a connection with them. I greet them as if we will maintain or share a connection in the future, and so on. But also, one of the key components of friendliness is to think again around the idea of what is a friend. We have different categories of friendships in our head. We have people we like to hang out with. We have people that we tend to suggest it's okay to do business with them, to work with them, but I would rather not hang out with them. There are friends that entertain you, but you will never do business with them. There are friends who are trustworthy, but they're not fun. And there are friends who are fun, but not trustworthy. See? So what happens is that when you look at these different complexities or layering of what a friend is, we end up with, again, degrees of what different kinds of friends are and what friendship is. But even in that scenario, we do not prioritize what kind of friend that it is that we are truly looking for. The category of mitra, the category of friend in the Buddhist tradition is a very simple, straightforward definition, which is that one who allows you to bring the best of you out, meaning one who allows the virtues to flourish. And that's a friend. But that's a very broad category of friend. It doesn't say anything about whether this person is going to be trustworthy or not, meaning that, sometimes friends who create hardships for you may bring you closer to enlightenment than somebody who's just hanging out with you. So it's very hard for the human mind to comprehend the different sort of notions of friendships. And oftentimes friendship for us is like a trial and error method. We learn as we go along. We trust, we get betrayed, then we calculate whether we should trust again or not, and so on and so forth. But when you broaden the category of this idea of maitri or metta, you start to gear towards this category of spiritual friendships. So meaning that while all these things of what defines friendships, these categories of friendship are important in conventional life, in social life. But there's a specific category of spiritual friendship that we should, again, sort of lean towards. And when you look at a broader category of spiritual friendship, meaning then all sentient beings become part of that category because they're all sort of there to help you flourish, help you sort of foster virtues in one way or the other. And then you get to the next category of karuna. And now remember that you have started with equanimity. So already you are moving away from these so-called natural urges of being kind to people that you already know, being kind to people who are already close to you. Because that's what generally happens in karuna, is that whenever you're trying to manifest karuna, there are these limitations that you encounter, meaning how kind I should be, who should I be kind to? Whether should I be kind to people who are related to me by blood, by kinship, by friendship, or people that I've just met 5 days ago, people who are in need, and so on and so forth. Meaning the mind is calculating who should you be kind to. But the second thing that happens is that the mind starts to look into how much kindness is enough. How much kindness is enough? And we human beings, we have a very terrible time knowing what is enough in all categories of things. We don't know what enough joy is. We don't know what enough suffering is. We don't know what enough misery is. Sometimes we conflate misery with pleasure, and then we don't know where enough lies at all. I still remember a cartoon in New York Times, the New Yorker, some years ago, where there's a guy standing next to a large Olympic-sized pool, looking at his 16-car garage and a big villa, and the caption said, "It's a lot, but is it enough?" We don't have a very good ability to deduce what is enough. But the mind wants to know that. The mind wants to know, well, where is the threshold of my kindness? Where's the limit of my kindness? And so on. And that again is only based on a certain worldview. It is based on a worldview where you think of kindness as in language of reciprocity. I'm being kind to somebody only as long as they are being kind to me. Unless they're my teenage kids, then I'm being kind to them and we'll test it out and see how far I can go. But what is a threshold of kindness? When can I say this is enough, that I shouldn't be kind anymore? So what happens is that this whole language, this transactional language around kindness and threshold of kindness is there because our mind is still hooked into this reward circuitry, this give and take, the sense of reciprocity, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with it as long as it is in balance, because that's how civic society functions. Otherwise, you will encounter a group of people who are just takers and not givers. And then the givers feel that they are taken advantage of, and so on. You see, so there's a sense of balance in this reward circuitry that has to be maintained. But that is not the worldview of a bodhisattva. When the bodhisattva is thinking about karuna, the entire enterprise of Mahayana is to short circuit, this reward circuitry. What I mean by short circuit, this reward circuitry, is that it begins, again, this is the second level of equanimity, which is this equanimity that is now not looking at your activity, your act of kindness as something that should be given back, that should come back to you. Now, it's a difficult concept to grasp. As long as you think of it as a concept, it's a difficult thing to grasp because transactionally it doesn't work out. But there are a couple of things that you can focus on. You see, first thing is that if you're simply thinking of kindness or compassion in the first layer, which is empathy. Now, empathy is something that we are biologically wired towards. And it's not necessarily a cultivation. Meaning, if your brain is functioning normally, you are generally empathetic. If your brain is screwed up in some ways, then you tell yourself, well, I take joy in people suffering, and people say, well, you should go see a psychiatrist because you recognize something is off. But the Buddhists are not suggesting that you should simply continue to abide in that sense of empathy. They're suggesting, well, can you build up on it? So when you start building up on it, then you start to think about, well, some sense of compassion, where maybe I'll give more and I'll get less. You're still transactional. You're still thinking about some sense of recognition or acknowledgement and so on. But it's a spectrum. It's a varying degree. Some people, they like to do good only when the cameras are on them. When somebody's observing, there's a third party who's observing it. Some people like to be kind only in terms of when it is reciprocated in terms of, in some forms of gratitude or gratefulness, where the person says, I owe you everything, I owe my existence, and so on. And it feeds our ego, and then it creates this kind of high and low. That's what we generally do with charity. That I'm in an advantageous position and I'm going to give something to somebody who's not in an advantageous position. So although from a social perspective, that act of charity is a good thing, from a Buddhist perspective, not really. Because yes, you can make arguments about merit, but it has done nothing to dismantle ego. It has done nothing of that category. And as Shantideva, very wonderfully suggested, that a perfect act of generosity is in which the giver, the receiver, and the object all have recognized shunyata, all have recognized the emptiness of things. That the object is only as valuable as what the person who's in need needs it to be. And it's only as valuable to the person who's giving is in terms of how much asset does the person have. But if they all recognize that it's all empty in certain ways, that there's no sense of, oh, I am giving this person an object of this value. So you deprive your senses of these kinds of value allocations to recognize the emptiness of things. And maybe it's happening simply at a cerebral level initially. But the more often you engage in that kind of activity, you're at least, your brain is not trying to constantly tell you to come back to this calculation mode that, oh, you're such a wonderful person who's giving to this person in need this object of great value. So you see, equanimity there allows us to then engage in this act of generosity in sort of a perfect form, where we are again short-circuiting this reward mechanism of seeking acknowledgement, seeking recognition, and more importantly, engaging in that activity because our ego derives certain kinds of pleasure from that. Then the third kind of engagement that occurs in these kinds of things is even a quiet sense of transaction. I give to somebody, nobody's watching, but I'm like, well, the God is watching, or bodhisattvas are watching, and this is definitely good karma. In the Western world, we call them brownie points. So the idea that now what the mind is doing is that it is subconsciously getting attached to how many brownie points it's collecting. It's keeping track of those brownie points. Some people actually do that. Like, my practice is to feed 10 people a day. Not always necessarily to feed 10 people a day because there are 10 needy people. It has to do with that my calculation of merit is a function of that I must feed 10 needy people a day. Now, from a social perspective, there's nothing wrong. It's a noble act. But when you ask yourself what is driving that sense of generosity, it has to do with the sense of ego. That the ego has to feel good today. The ego has to be in a good mood by engaging in these kinds of activities. So what the Buddhists, and specifically the Mahayana tradition, keeps pushing one is to say, no, you need to start thinking about the notion of great compassion, of Mahakaruna, meaning that that's where the cultivation should lead you to. And what is Mahakaruna? Mahakaruna is not that you engage in particularities of compassionate activities. It is the cultivation of your presence as a compassionate being. So that your mind is not tied to sort of just this day-to-day engagements of compassionate activities, trying to keep track of it. And so you take somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's not thinking every day how many people he has fed. He's not thinking how many people he has nursed or cared for and so on. But he has cultivated compassion in a manner that his presence inspires many people to engage in those kinds of activities, just to carry out those functions, those tasks, and so on. And His Holiness has often said this, even in different times. He said, I don't understand why people feel so good around me. Meaning that, he says, I'm a simple monk. I don't have anything to give to them. You know, I say some kind words, I say some gentle words, but I don't have anything to give to them. And so you start thinking about, well, if he doesn't have anything to give to them in a tangible sense, meaning he's also not like a psychologist sitting there counseling people. He's just being himself, which is an embodiment of Mahakaruna, this compassionate being. So just by his presence, he's able to alleviate suffering. When one is able to get to that stage of Mahakaruna, then you're not feeling the sense of how much compassion is enough, or how many people should it be for, who should benefit from it. You see, recently, we were at a meeting in Dharamshala a couple of months ago. It was very interesting, and somebody kept calling him the Dalai Lama of Tibet, the Dalai Lama of Tibet. And so His Holiness paused for a bit, and he chuckled. He says, you know, I was once the Dalai Lama of Tibet. It's not that I'm no longer that, but I think it's probably right to say that I am Dalai Lama of the world. And if you evaluate that statement, it's perfectly on point. He is the Dalai Lama of the world. Meaning that his sense of great compassion is such that it doesn't matter. You will meet, we are getting recorded, so I can tell you these stories, but I'll tell you, maybe I've told you the story before here. So one time we were hosting His Holiness at Harvard. You can edit it out later on. Sometimes recording is, that's why I like oral tradition without recording. Yeah. So one time, His Holiness is being hosted by Harvard. I'm there, and there's a lot of excitement on campus. But it's Harvard. There's excitement every other week. There's some Nobel Prize winner coming in, coming out. And as then we're trying to figure out with Secret Services which is a good route to take him to someplace and so on. So we figure out this. As it often happens, that when you're trying to look for most secure pathways, they're not the most elegant pathways. They're like down through a no-name hallway or a dungeon and so on. And so bringing His Holiness to the campus, to the venue where he has to speak through one of these underground tunnel hallways kind of thing, and he's walking.
Secret path.
Huh?
The secret path.
The secret path, And he's walking, and there's a Secret Service, and they're sort of moving things around and moving people around. And there was this Hispanic janitor. She was cleaning. The hallway. She was just there. And so when she saw this excitement, she got nervous. People like agents dressed in law enforcement kind of thing. So she takes a broomstick, backs up against the wall, and everybody's walking. First layer of security walk by, second layer, and then His Holiness is there. His Holiness is going slowly, and then he looks at her, and he sees. So His Holiness just comes around, puts his arm around her. Everybody's frozen, stopped kind of thing. And His Holiness sort of just looked at her and just smiled. And this woman, she has no idea who this person is. She's just there kind of a bit. His Holiness sort of pokes at her belly. Pokes at her belly and goes, fat, no good. I've lived long enough in the US that part of my brain was like, oh, this is going to be a lawsuit. When you have organized enough visits and things, your mind goes into that kind of thing. That woman was very elated, very happy. His Holiness went on, gave his talk and all this thing. 3 weeks later, I'm on campus and I see her. Her name was Karina. She was one of these janitors from South America. So, hey, Karina, how are you? She's like, I'm very good. You have lost some weight. Susantidad, he told me to lose weight. I was like, how many people can do that? Latin women, they are strong. If somebody else had tried to tell her that you're fat, they would get punched in the face. But this sense of great compassion, to the point that she took it to heart. She didn't know who this person was. But just this one interaction changed it so much that even this, half advice that His Holiness gave her, that the fat is no good, she took it to heart and she was working. So, what I'm trying to say is that people think about practice of compassion, practice of kindness, and they say, well, we get fatigued, we get tired. There's so many people in need. There's so many people who are in want. But the idea, the imagery is to become a reservoir of compassion. That is what Mahakaruna is. Mahakaruna is not this sort of transactional compassion or this biased sense of compassion and so on that we practice. That the idea is to get to this stage of Mahakaruna. And that again is only facilitated if you have cultivated some degree of equanimity, to be able to get past these kinds of reward mechanisms in terms of what am I going to get out of this kind act or kind word and so on. Then you get to the state of mudita, to the state of joy. And joy is again something that we don't have much of. We have moments of it. It's not like it's a completely foreign concept to it, but it is again something that we don't have much of. And even there, what happens is that joy, in some ways, as an excitement, is a fleeting moment, just like any other emotional state. But when the Buddhists are talking about cultivation of joy, that's not what they want you to do. So that there are twofold sort of elements to that. One is in the cultivation phase of joy, which is the very sort of practice of rejoicing. And that's again something we don't do a lot, which is to rejoice in somebody else's accomplishment, or to rejoice in, when you observe an act of kindness. Oftentimes you will see that when somebody has done something kind and you're observing it, it sort of brings a nice feeling to you. Keep that feeling. Then you say to the person, you did something good, you did something nice. And if you look at the Nyingma schools, Longchen Ramjam has his own commentary on the Four Immeasurables, and he talks about, in the Nyingma language, of transforming the 5 poisons by virtue of the Four Immeasurables, by virtue of cultivating the Four Immeasurables. And so there also, Longchen Ramjam, he suggests that, if you focus on just the practice of rejoicing, where your mind is completely free from envy and jealousy, from the poisons of jealousy and envy. Why? Because you cultivate this antidote of rejoicing, not just rejoicing in a superficial sense. Oh, congratulations, but I'm going to get you next time. But sort of a sincere sense of rejoicing. And to experience that, and to sort of foster that kind of mental state in whatever group, team, or professions or family that you are in, that on a daily basis to be able to rejoice just for different reasons. So, then you get to the abiding state of mudita, which is this joy. And that joy is the sustained sense of joy. The sustained sense of joy that is not simply an aftermath of something. See, right now when we experience joy, rejoice, or even preliminary sense of rejoicing, it is an aftermath of some activity, some accomplishment, some state. But when the Buddhists are talking about one as a first person, this sense of joy, is this serene sense of joy, a stable sense of joy. It doesn't have too many peak moments. But it is also not a state of joy that is self-absorbed. See, so sometimes what happens in meditators is that if you have spent enough time alone meditating, you can still cultivate a level of mudita, but that mudita is tied to your self-absorption. As long as you're in meditative state, you're joyful. The moment you step out of the meditative state, meaning the post-meditative state, anything can go at that moment in time. But here, the stable sense of joy implies that not only while in the act of meditation or the practice of meditation, but even in post-meditative states, that you're able to maintain that sense of joy or impart that sense of joy. And that doesn't mean that, that joy will always be unhindered. So you will still go through ebbs and flows of that. But for the most part, you're able to look at yourself and say, I'm in a joyful state. Now, the beauty of I'm in a joyful state is that it is also contagious. Meaning that, what does it mean to impart joy to others? It's not that you tell them joke all the time. It's not that you entertain them all the time. To impart joy to others means that you cultivate this joyful presence, such that people around you are able to experience that joy and say, that person, I like to hang around with that person. Why? Because I feel encouraged. I feel joyful. I feel not being turned down or something of that nature. Meaning all of us have different sort of vibes, energy fields, so to speak, based on our emotional states. And being in a joyful state is a really sort of beautiful sort of episode to be in. And then, of course, you have this element which is in the recitation of the Four Immeasurables, that this wish, this aspiration that may all be free from suffering and causes of suffering and so on, that may all never be separated from the sacred happiness, devoid of suffering. Meaning that those kinds of aspirational stages, again, become much more meaningful, much more prominent when you yourself are able to cultivate this sense of Four Immeasurable in you, within yourself. And the reason it is immeasurable is because it should not be tied to a concept of enough. It should not be tied to a concept of biases, of this tribe, these many people, this many number, this many events, and so on. Meaning that from the very onset, it needs to be immeasurable in its orientation. And making it immeasurable in its orientation begins with equanimity at the first thing, because you have to recognize that sentient beings are immeasurable. And so immeasurable are the cause for enlightenment. And you sort of work with that. Then when you get to equanimity again, because it comes back in a cycle, then you are able to sort of get into the abiding state. So up to now, it was all cultivation of Four Immeasurables. But then next time you encounter equanimity, now it's in an abiding state. An abiding state there then implies sort of, maintaining a state or sustaining a state where the mind is not, too much sort of entangled with the eight worldly winds, the highs and lows of life and so on. And again, it is not to say that the mind becomes indifferent or dull. It's simply that the mind chooses what it's focusing on. It solves what it can solve for. It contributes where it can contribute, but it maintains a sense of equanimity, because there, the individual doesn't have the sense that, am I doing enough? They don't get into the tendencies of low self-esteem, that I could be doing much more better. Meaning that you are there. It's like, I think it was Suzuki Roshi, one of the early Zen teachers in the US, who says, his students were asking what he thought of everybody there. Suzuki Roshi goes, each one of you is perfect. And each one of you needs a little work. And that's the thing, that it's not that you're not thinking about a horse race, that I have to get there too fast and so on. So the joy, that the aspiration is there, the equanimity is there, and you continue to build on that sense of equanimity. And this is why the Four Immeasurables are a beautiful precursor or foundational ground for cultivation of bodhicitta. Meaning that even in the generation stage of bodhicitta, it's actually the schemata of Four Immeasurables that helps you stabilize the generation stage of bodhicitta. And so it's a very important sort of pathway in that. And so maybe I'll take a pause here. Sure. But I hope that next time you recite the Four Immeasurables, it's all right to wish good things on people. Nobody says it's a bad thing. But to think of how to embody the Four Immeasurables, as some of you are aware, in the Buddhist iconography, sometimes we talk about Chenrezig's four hands as the Four Immeasurables, right? It's not that you will grow two more hands. You could solve some problems or add to it, who knows? You'll have to pay twice as much when you go for your next manicure session. But the whole idea that how to embody these kinds of Four Immeasurables and sort of weave it into your practice. Buddhist prayers are not just about praying for somebody else. Every prayer, every aspiration is a cultivation. And that cultivation needs to happen within one's own sort of process. And the more it happens, the more your prayers will become powerful. And the most important thing is to think about the sense of Mahakaruna. Like, how do you get to that stage? And how to abide in that state?
Any questions?
Anybody, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. All the teachings of Buddha, there is a place where he gives teaching, or where he gave teaching, and there's the audience, and there's the theme. When we are talking about the four immeasurables, yes, we are familiar with the content. What is the content? Could you throw some more light where he gave this teaching and who was the audience? And the subset of this is we are using it for immeasurable, but the Sanskrit word is Brahma vihara. So why is that title? And does this English translation capture that?
No, that's a very good question. So I have to jolt my memory as to where exactly, but in the Nikaya it is mentioned where he was and with who it was. And I can send the name of that particular episode. And also I think in the Karande Sutra, I think there's an episode that's mentioned there as well. Sometimes, such things are also repeated in various sutras. So it could happen in more than one occasion. Now, the thing is with the notion of Brahma Vihara, if you look at sort of the Pali origins of it, of the four Brahma Viharas, it's simply speaking of, maintaining these four states. That these are the four states of the mind that a practitioner should constantly abide in. And the reason they're calling it Brahma Vihara, because there, Brahma is more of a signifier of a higher stage, not particularly of a Brahma as in a God figure and so on, but a higher state. And Vihara as an abiding and so on. I think in the later aspect of certain Mahayana explanations, when the focus was more on the cultivation than the abiding aspect, when the commentary started to talk about cultivation of it, that's where I think some of the tendencies change. And there's no literal kind of thing as immeasurable. But if you look at it, oftentimes what would happen, especially in the Mahayana text, that when Buddha is giving certain kinds of teaching and somebody asks when, what time period, and so on, you get a very hyperbolic response. You'll get a response like, as many as the grains of sand in the bank of river Ganges, times 5. Your mind was having difficult enough time comprehending what the first thing was times 5. So you get these kinds of things. And I have a theory around it. And my theory is that it's a brilliant way to push the human brain into a state of imaginative vision, rather than this finite set of numbers and things and particularities of stuff. And so you will see many a times, like even important questions like, when will this person get Buddhatva or Arachya? He would give this kind of response that as many as, sands in this area or that area. So I think the immeasurable translation is simply to denote that, which is that it's not comprehensible. And we should think of it not in terms of finite metrics, but in terms of immeasurable in scope, because of the whole idea of sentient beings. Because the focus of four Brahma Vihara in the Pali thing is me being in the state of four Brahma Viharas. In Mahayana, it becomes cultivating the four Brahma Viharas for the sake of countless sentient beings. That's one speculation. Yeah.
There is the reason why it's called the Brahma Vihara, because when you cultivate different civilizations, so there is the realm of the 33.
Yes.
Accordingly, when you cultivate these, then you're supposed to abide with the Brahma and those gods. So that's the reason why it's called Brahma Vihara.
Yeah, but you don't actually hang out with the Brahmas. Yes. Just to be clear.
And also because it's in the Yoga Sutras. So within the Yoga Sutras, these come. So
Yeah, it's not unique to Buddhism.
Yeah.
It's not unique to Buddhism, but it's all about the interpretation and the focus of how it comes about.
My question is more towards cultivating these measures and their applications kind of like in real life. So in real life, when we face certain problems, how do we actually cultivate them as opposed to situations which are very practical? Because let's say, for example, you're facing a court case and I'm doing this. My personal experience is that it doesn't work. If I'm doing this with these people, I think that we all have shared belief. We have a shared belief in the fiat currency, so it works. Within communes and like Dharma centers, we have a shared belief in karma, so it works. Like when you get the example of the holiness, the corresponding example is of the Pope. So a lot of people feel that, but I mean, if you look at the cardinal voting system and all, I don't necessarily believe that Pope is a spiritual person. When you spoke of the lady in the hallway, so we know that like a lot of people in South America are highly Catholic and believe in things. It also possibly could be because of that influence. So how do we actually see the relevance of these immeasurables in modern life and inculcate them?
It's so, I mean, the first thing is that there's no standard sense of shared view. Modern life is a hodgepodge. It's a very heterogeneous sense of things. So you cannot say which dominant worldview should I go for. The second thing is that, yes, Four Immeasurable has a language to it, but it's the cultivation part, it's the abiding part that is more important. The number of times you meet people who say, they have recited 1 million money mantras, but you sense that they don't have an iota of compassion. It's not a problem of worldview, it's a problem of cultivation. It's a problem of maybe they needed 2 million money mantras to get to the state where they could manifest that. So I think, it's, you have to understand one thing about practice. It's like a car salesman says, the mileage varies by users. So you can have a template of practice, of any practice. The mileage varies by users. So you cannot say that, I don't experience it because I have done it for so many times with these kinds of people. Maybe it needs to be done more. Maybe it needs to be done less. Maybe it's not getting manifested. And this is something, if you read the writings of the Kada masters, they tell you in all kinds of ways how people used to get very heady about certain cultivations, but it wouldn't manifest in their life. I mean, you find great Kadampa teachers who learned lesson about compassion cultivation that way. So I think, it's all a function of the effort and the time and the recognition of it. Part of the thing is also to recognize our own frustration at times with practice, because sometimes there's real gap and sometimes there's artificial gap. We read a lot, we hear a lot, we want to get to that state as quickly as possible. Of course we all do, because time is limited and so on. But sometimes our practice, or even the levels of our practices, doesn't catch up with what we have read and what we have heard. That causes frustration as well in an individual. So I think, it's a combination of such things that one needs to focus on. That's fine. That's fine. Don't believe in karma. When karma gets to you, then talk to it. Given all the known and unknown variables in life, in the universe, I would rather live a life believing in karma than not. Pure calculation. Pure calculation. Not just to be safe. You can start with the pretext of being safe. But then you begin to derive joy from all those things that allows you to focus on what it means to be virtuous in life. No, it's a different sense of joy, because I'm not doing it for somebody else's sake. You see, then in my commentary, I don't say, What do I do with it when other people don't acknowledge it?
Richard, when, as you know, the third line, when we recite it in the Mahayana system, I myself will enable them. When did that start? Who started that? Taking responsibility, the courage of the third line. It seems to be a kind of courage.
I cannot say if it is in a particular time period when it started. But you can find, that as early, at least in the written thing, you find as early as 4th century. Fourth, this sense of courage.
The Kadams came quite a bit
Kadam came later. Yeah, the Kadam masters came later. But you find even, I think, in certain sort of early Mahayana authors, because the whole idea there was the courage that came with the community. Because the whole sense of Sangha sort of grew in its scope in Mahayana system. And that also grew in the sense of the responsibility, meaning what is the nature of a Sangha? What is the role of a Sangha? And then if you sort of pushed it a bit more, then there was this sense of, that's the archetype in Avalokiteshvara, right? The responsibility, the courage to take responsibility for freeing all beings.
Okay, so thank you so much. I have a thought like this. So what is the how? So how do you cultivate? Like is it prayers, aspirations, like what are those?
Aspiration is useful. Prayer is also useful. So it's quite systematic, the cultivation. So, for example, when you begin your meditation on even a preliminary state of equanimity, you begin by looking at your own biases. You evaluate why those biases are there, why the sense of this person is dear, this person is not dear, and so on. Then you say, well, is this arbitrary? And if I'm going to take on this path, should I just settle with this? What else can I do to broaden the scope? Then there's a deep recognition of the interdependence, the interconnectedness with sentient beings. So even in the sense of equanimity, you start to lose the sense of separation if you do it at a deeper level. You see, right now, we talk about interdependence or interconnectedness just to describe a phenomenon. It's a description in art. It's not an experience. But when you start to cultivate this even preliminary state of equanimity, it starts to translate into experience. That experience then overwhelms you at times. So you have to again maintain equanimity at the face of getting overwhelmed. Then you go naturally into this cultivation of metta, because now you have felt the connection with sentient beings and karuna. And then you come back, repeat, and it deepens itself, opening up new insights.
Sorry. I wanted to actually ask you about your book.
I don't remember anything I wrote.
Could you just share with us the process you went through while you were doing this book? And I feel you need to do another one about your relationship with this holiness of God.
Yes,
I
yes.
think that part is huge.
So,
And then what is related to the experience that I had? How did you demystify this mystery for yourself when you were growing up, with all your encounters with all these teachings?
there's no demystification. No. There are things I'm skeptical. There are things that I'm skeptical of, and there are things that I take at face value. I evaluate it over a period of time. So in my opening thing, I make a distinction. I say that human experiences, we tend to simply label them as rational or irrational. Rational, that we have demystification processes around it. irrational, that nobody can relate to it, then it's irrational. I suggest that there's a third realm, which is non-rational. And non-rational is that which is still waiting to be understood in certain form. It's not, there's enough substance to it that it is not irrational. And that's where I kind of leave it, and it's okay for humans to not to be able to make sense of every experience. Sometimes it's useful to be in a suspended state, and then see when it opens up, when it evaluates, and then it sort of makes sense or reveals itself and so on. And I think that's one of the things with mystery of any sort, is that we try to demystify it because we want to make sense of it, or we want to put it aside because it doesn't make sense to us. But I think, when you're in this non-rational, suspended state, you're still engaging with mystery for whatever it is. And you go through your cycles of life, and then you see what comes next.
The next volume is coming soon.
Yeah, so when I started it, it actually turned out to be like a 700-page book, and myself being, wary of reading 700 pages book, I said, don't want to subject my readers to that. So hopefully there'll be another version. That was the thing, that when
What was most challenging for you?
not to sugarcoat it. There's a tendency sometimes to sugarcoat it. People expected that I just write a plain book on Buddhist meditation, sort of thing, with the title saying Buddha's teachings and meditation. Wasn't interested in that. Was interested in lived experiences. Was interested in, and I'm too young to write a memoir or anything like that. The happy medium was that I'll focus on the life of teachers and my encounter with them, with some sort of tidbits about early part of my life. But that was precisely the decision, because I did not want the content of my time with His Holiness it couldn't be in one or two chapters.
Yeah, that's.
So that was the thing. So we decided that perhaps for the next project.
And how did your readers, let's say abroad, react to the stratification system in India? You've written about that.
Yeah.
So as a sociologist, I was interested to know.
It's very interesting, because a lot more people are aware of stratification system in the US because of the way Westerners write about Indian history and class systems. So even by middle school, people know what caste system and things of that nature are. I think what was more interesting was that people started to focus more about what was unique about Buddha in terms of challenging that system. And that early on, because Americans like to think that the Americans and the Europeans are the most egalitarian society, and they have all the movements and so on. So it corrected that view for some of those individuals. But yeah. Yes. You want to ask?
Yeah.
Okay, you ask.
So when you were speaking about back to the Brahma Viharas, what is it that one could anchor joy in? Because for both equanimity as well as compassion, you gave, rather fundamental reasons one can always go back and think about. But for joy, when you come out of your meditative state and into the world, how do you maintain that level of joy using a reason?
One micro experiment that I've often suggested to my students with this process, not only with joy, but there's a element of correlation between curiosity and a sense of joy. That the more you're curious about things, just a childlike curiosity, the more you're able to find reasons to be joyful, if you're looking for reasons to be joyful or to tether them. It's a practice called one new thing per day, which is that you deliberately try to notice one new thing. And you don't say, I want to notice one new thing that should be profound or that I should be joyful for or anything. Just say one new thing in your experience. The same path that you're walking, one new thing. Same people you're interacting with, one new thing. Anything. And again, you don't have to make it 10 new things a day. We get greedy about such experiences. Just one new thing. And to do it in a systematic manner. And you will notice all the wonderful things that are there that can trigger this thing. And then when a series of such triggers happen, your mind is able to find a tethering point. And that tethering point, again, deepens this sense of curiosity and insight. And does this. I'll tell you about this experience. So for the first 13 months of the pandemic, I had no interaction with human beings, not a single human being. I was in a remote area in the mountains in Arizona, living by myself. Didn't go out or anything like that. But it's all desert. And so what happened, as you have read instances here, that after a while, wildlife started to come closer to humanity. So I'll sit in the backyard, which is backed up to a national forest, and I'll have different kinds of wildlife, like bobcats and things. And I would just sit there and I would just observe. And then they would observe me, and I would observe them. They would come closer. I'll go closer. And so I had a family of owls camping there for 6-7 months, and they had 2 little owlings, 2 little kids. Just to see them, observe them. I'll sit there with my shot of espresso, watching them learning how to fly. Right? I'm there doing my prayers, but this observation, and then they being curious, coming very close and so on. But what it did was that you found little things that you were observing, and you say, the world is phenomenal. The world is such a wonderful place. Like the mind doesn't, prior to that even, the mind was like, oh, I should go watch a beautiful sunset or stand at the edge of the ocean, to experience the sort of how magnificent things are. But here, I was trapped, and the world was coming to me in the form of these things where we couldn't communicate and so on. But just observing them, it was just delightful. Every morning I'll do my prayers, and the hummingbirds will be around with it, and and you welcome that experience and so on. So.
Venerable, yeah, we can take some questions on Zoom now. Sorry.
Sure.
Was that a little loud? Yeah.
No.
I think Ranjani had a question in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself, please do. If you would like to ask.
Well, that gentleman had a question. Did you ask your question? Maybe there's a gentleman holding his hand for a while. Let me ask him, and then
Yeah, okay.
When you talk about transactional experience, then you talk about the general calculation for Brahma, for example. As per my understanding, the transaction or an analytical for the synonyms. So how do you write this experience where transaction or the analytical process leading to a creativity part? Like what are the basic families with this Buddha?
I think partly it's a function of what stage of practice you're in. So, for example, in some of the preliminary stages, even a broader understanding of, say, broader categories of virtuous or non-virtuous, just pertaining to yourself, not pertaining just to sort of some kind of moral landscape of things, but the idea that I believe kindness is a good thing. I want to be a bit more kind than I am. Just a simple thing. Then what you do is you evaluate any kind of experiences or insights that you have whether the needle has shifted towards more kindness that particular day or not. Meaning, are the thoughts more kind? Are they kinder towards somebody else? Are they kinder towards you? Or whatever the outcome of a particular thought or action is going to be. Is that going to be kind? It sounds like a very simple layout in some ways, but it's a wonderful sort of tool to get started on. When you start to look at certain kinds of sort of virtue aspects of things, and then you move to ego. Ego is much more difficult to catch, meaning, is it contributing to an ego building exercise or an ego shattering exercise, or what is it doing really? So that can become a bit more tricky. So start with like some baseline things around virtue. Meaning, nobody, at least in my circle, and I've had a lot of debates with people from all disciplines, but nobody has ever argued against kindness to me. Nobody has said that, that it's a bad idea for the world to be a little more kind, or for individuals in the world to be a little more kind. That's a systematic issue again, right? Because, so that's where I was talking about the urge to be kind versus actually being kind. So when the background of the begging industry and the whole enterprise, they are a highly entrepreneurial group of people. Very entrepreneurial. Before pandemic, during teaching seasons, you used to have beggars take train from Bihar to Dharamshala and back. Every time His Holiness was teaching. And the strategy was very clear. His Holiness is going to talk about compassion. 5,000 people are going to listen to it. They're going to come back. And the first urge they will have is, who do I give money to? And so they facilitated that process.
Freeloaders Incorporated.
Yeah, they facilitated the process, And they were very organized. They would take, like right now I ask him, where is His Holiness teaching next and so on. You could ask them. They had the whole calendar. And they would tell you which train goes where. My students who used to come to these teachings, I had to discipline them. I had to discipline them by saying, fine, you want to do that. I want you to only attend the teaching with 10 rupee bills. Because the urge is going to be there. You'll feel like you're doing something wrong by not giving. But I want you to be disciplined and do 10 rupee bills and later write a check to a school or to a food bank or something of that nature. So again, the differentiation between the immediate urge for this reward reciprocity versus doing something in a more organized manner that solves the issue. Analysis of virtue is important. Analysis of virtue is important in order to stabilize it. You see, otherwise you will hear things like how people complain about, I don't want to be kind anymore. People just take advantage of me because I did not analyze how it is that I was being kind. So okay, virtue is not just, in Buddhist tradition, virtue is not just a dictum. They just don't say, go out and be good. There's an analysis around how to be good, who to be good to, in what form can you be good to. Those are the things that is in a practitioner's mind.
So we also have some people online who'd like to ask questions. Maybe give some time for them also. Maybe last question from you.
Just start one place, start with the analysis, and then go on from there. No. The key thing is that the expansion and contraction should not happen according to your expectation. You understand that? The challenge with, you see, when you bring samsaric frames of references to your spiritual practice, and what is meant by samsaric frame here is that you're using the same kinds of metrics, right? So we are using the same kind of analysis in terms of, if I do this for so many days, I should get to this stage. And then that doesn't happen. So that's what I mean, that you cannot sort of just go into that kind of mode. Things don't happen. One of my dear friends who was a Benedictine monk, Thomas Keating, he used to say, the problem is not that, the problem is not that we want to understand God. The problem is that we want to understand God on our own terms. Okay. And that is the thing with the practice of meditation and so on, that it's not the gap necessarily just about the practice. It's this mind constantly telling you that you must recognize it on your own terms and in your own timeline. And that's the first thing that needs to be, one needs to let go of. Should I move here now? Okay. Go ahead, please.
Venerable, good evening. Pranam. My question is, if we are already perfect, what are we working towards? Where is the need for cultivating or abiding in the four immeasurables?
If you're perfect, that's wonderful. The work is in all the other sentient beings around you, and that should preoccupy your time. That's how Buddha used this time. That's how I would encourage you to use your time as well. So. Sure. So, this is sort of now using a Western overlay on Buddhist teaching. What I'm about to say is a Western overlay in some ways. Meaning the thing is that if you look at even a classic text like Bodhicharyavatara in the Mahayana body of Shastras, and it talks about straightforward cultivation of Bodhisattva path. So, when you read it carefully, it tells you about certain things. It tells you how important self-compassion is before exercising it on others. It tells you how a bodhisattva cannot be a person with low self-esteem, meaning that it is a heroic process. It goes into detail about what the characteristics of that heroic process is, and so on. So one needs to do that systematically in that development. So Buddhists are not suggesting that you should be kind to everybody at your own detriment, and so on. Yes, when we encounter ordinary acts of altruism, we do see that. Right? But you also have to take into account that most of us actually don't know what it is to be kind. Most of us only knows how to be validated. Most of us are seeking approval. We're not seeking kindness. We are seeking approval. That's why the cultivation of equanimity is important. As you analyze that, you will recognize that you're trapped in all these biases. So even simple cultivations of loving kindness, compassion, joy were misguided because they were misguided because of the biases. So we were doing all these practices, but only seeking validation. But it is built into the system. If we sort of study it and practice it accordingly, we'll find that out, we'll discover it. I don't know if there are other questions here.
I think we're, sorry, yeah, Anushri, you had a question? Go ahead.
Venerable, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah.
It's
So,
everybody can hear you.
Venerable, so like the best type of offering which you talked about is when the object, the person who's making the offering, and the person to whom the offering is being made to, all three of them have realized shunyata. So what does that mean?
It means basically that the giver realizes that he or she is nobody special. He realizes that the object has no intricate value to it, and realizes that the receiver is also nobody special in terms of object of pity or so on. So unlike ordinary acts of charity, here the receiver also has a sense of dignity, and the object is only as useful as the receiver acknowledges it to be. It's a thing about, in our mind we think that, I'm giving a gold coin to somebody, and we become egotistical that we want to tell this story in the future that, I was so generous that I gave a gold coin to this person, and so on. That's where the ego is, and the value allocation of the gold coin is. But as one Zen master used to say, gold dust is precious, but when it gets in your eyes, it's not so much. So this idea that this value allocation is a phenomenon happening from the ego as well. And then maintaining the dignity of the receiver by acknowledging that the person is also not somebody who's lower to them, or unfortunate in circumstances, meaning not making stories or narratives around that, but just to give because the opportunity is there. There's another hands up. I know you. I can't hear you. Still cannot hear you. Yeah. She's muted.
It's Maya.
Ask to unmute.
Maya, yeah? Unmute yourself.
So I think we have to just click here.
Yeah. Allow participants. Okay, now you can. Boliye, Maya.
Yes. Thank you. Finally. Yeah. So thank you so much, Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, for this very lucid, and very felt experiential elucidation of these ideas. So first of all, I just want to thank you, and so wonderful to see you. My question was, when we talk about no bias, is it possible to sort of end up with a sense of a bias towards the superiority of the Mahayana path? Because it's Maha, it's greater, it's more, it avoids the pitfalls of some of the others. And how might one get out of that kind of egoic projection? Or self-congratulation? Sorry?
By giving up Mahayana.
By giving up Mahayana. That's a very Zen sort of.
No, it's not. It's not. You see, the thing is, you have to understand what is the Maha in Maha, right? As you asked. We can define Mahayana in terms of the traditional polemical views of superiority. But also we can define Mahayana simply in terms of the greatness and scope of things, which puts the burden and reflection back on the practitioner. But if you take the second route, you immediately realize that the other definitions of Mahayana are not that relevant for a practitioner. And one of the things with the Mahayana is that there's no Mahayana without cultivation of bodhicitta. So if it suits one, then abide in bodhicitta and give up Mahayana, and it's totally fine. Now, if you have a problem with superiority of bodhicitta, that's another question.
No, but you understand where I'm coming from.
I
here.
am. Yeah. No, I think you have to understand that there's a thing of Mahayana as a pathway and Mahayana as an institution, or many institutions. And as a practitioner, one needs to be just cautious of that. That's why I said that one needs a deeper sense of familiarity between what it is understanding by Maha. Is it the polemical view of superiority, or is it Maha in terms of the scope of things?
Yeah. No, but even in that, I didn't mean the very shallow sense of, polemically superior, but also this idea that it is inherently better, therefore, because it is more.
No,
you know what I mean? It's sort of.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is a question of inherently better, because we all tend to avoid any aspects of inherent.
Yeah.
It's not a question of inherently better. It's a question mostly of what is the primary driver for your practice. And so for people like Chandakirti and others, if there's actually a very functional perspective around this thing, which is that there are more dangers of self-absorption for a meditator or practitioner if they do not recognize the primacy of sentient beings as a driver. And that is the important aspect. So that's why you'll find, there's no singular sort of enterprise in terms of what makes Mahayana superior and so on. It's a question of what is a driver. And when you ask certain Mahayana teachers, even somebody as traditional as somebody like Kalu Rinpoche, the previous Kalu Rinpoche, for example, when he had a chance to meet some Theravada monks, they didn't talk much, but when Kalu Rinpoche saw this one person from Myanmar, he basically says, oh, this person is a bodhisattva. Okay? It's a recognition between the siddhas.
Great Rahul Sanskrita also managed to know all the school of thought in one.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, there's inherent things built into the institution where one cites the superiority of Mahayana and so on. But I think at some point one can step away from it if one so chooses to. When you go deep into that kind of division, then it's not just the Mahayana, it's the question of which version of Mahayana, the Dripum's version or the Sera's version. Then it's not even about the Dripum or Sera. Which Khamsang's version is better? So, the question of identity and superiority has to be managed at all levels.
Yeah.
It's not just a function of Mahayana.
Yeah. But I think what I was really talking about is a kind of spiritual ego that, can sort of residual spiritual ego at the sort of, after you've sort of emptied out everything, as it were.
Have you read my book? There's a whole chapter dedicated to it.
I need to read your book, but I have heard you in conversation with Bob Thurman and others about the book. So I do need to, I need to get hold of it.
Spiritual ego is a very sly thing, and one needs to be aware of it.
Sorry?
Also about the Krishna in Karol Bagh temple.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll just quickly ask. There is a clear hierarchy I see between teachings and meanings, in the sense that sometimes I feel that teachings or Dharma teachings take away the objective analysis I could do. Like, for example, where is do I see an independent I? Like, before I could come up with my own conclusion, there is always this thing like, oh, independent I. So I don't know how to overcome that problem.
His Holiness has the best method. He used to say that when I read Buddhist texts, I'm a staunch Buddhist. When I analyze it, I become a Marxist. And that's the way to go, I think. Like if you're really seriously, I mean, it's basically a way of lightly saying what Buddha suggested in his own words, which was, don't read it as a faithful. Read and analyze my work as a goldsmith analyzes the purity of gold, burn it, smash it, and so on. Buddha did not say that to make his audience feel better. He said it so that the audience can actually pursue that path. And someone managed that, but we fear, you have to understand something like, there are all these borderline sort of engagements in terms of practice. There's reverence, but in true reverence, there's no fear. You still tremble, but there's no fear. It's a different kind of trembling. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Don't forget to take water.
Yeah.
I was wondering about one of the aspects or types of giving is the giving of fearlessness.
Yeah.
Fearlessness. And I'm seeing when I was earlier involved in like activist kind of work in areas where people are displaced, you also said that times are such that anything could happen at any time and put us to distress. Whether it's a pandemic or people dying. War. So in India, at least, I've seen people who are involved in activist work. They develop very strong antipathies towards the people they see as oppressors. They want to give that fearlessness. They want to protect people. Or it could be animals or an environment or a way of life. But there's a tendency, and they acknowledge it themselves. Tenzin said, Fritz said once, that when he was doing this kind of work, he became terribly angry. And that's why he gave it up. So how to avoid that extreme antipathy you can develop towards a person who you see as an oppressor against the victim?
You see, that's again, as I mentioned earlier, that it's very easy for our mind to take on biases for whatever reasons, however we may justify it or rationalize it and so on. The thing is to ask yourself, can you still do that work? And it's a very important work in certain areas of the world. But can you still do that work without demonizing the other? Because that's essentially what the Bodhisattva path is speaking of. And I don't believe to say something like because it'll trigger anger, I should give it up and things like that is a particularly useful path. There are all kinds of people in the world, all groups of people and so on. You can still disagree with somebody in very strong language and very strong terms without demonizing them, no matter how violent the oppressor is. Meaning that in your mind, you can still sort of, you can condemn everything that the person is doing, but not take, again, the dignity of personhood, because then you're doing the same thing that they are doing for others. That's not a solution. So I think that it's, from a practitioner perspective, it's important to be aware of that, be mindful of that. I remember some years ago, His Holiness visited MIT, and he was giving some talk, and Americans were plagued by the Bush regime. And so one student got up and asked, Your Holiness, what do you think of George Bush Jr.? And His Holiness's immediate response was, I love George Bush. There was pinned off silence in the auditorium. In Massachusetts, all Democrats, liberals. And here's Dalai Lama from state saying, I love George Bush. And then he took a pause and then he said, but I don't particularly like his policies. I disagree with it. And then he went on to clarify in such wonderful words that actually a few months later, one of the faculty members told me that he was one of those people who had this visceral reaction when anybody used to talk about anything good about George Bush. Like, there are people who just shake violently kind of thing. He said he was one of those people. And then he was at this talk and observed this interaction between the student and the Dalai Lama. And he said, well, I said to myself that, the Dalai Lama is the head of one of the most oppressed groups in the world. And if he can override such rage and hatred, I'm not even a direct group of somebody oppressed by George Bush. Why do I have this towards him? And he said, what was magical in those 6 months, he said it took some work, but he said that he feels much more light. He doesn't walk around with tremendous weight on his shoulder of angst and hatred towards this particular individual. So I do believe it's a question of how one perceives such things. We live in a very complex world, very, very complex world. And it's very easy sometimes to just create this thing of oppressor and whatnot. But as a Buddhist, I think, again, the challenge is that you don't actually succumb to the mindset of the oppressor, which is hatred and anger.
Maybe call it a day.
Or call it a night.
On behalf of Tushita, I'm very grateful that you took out some time for us today. Thank you so much.
It's a
And please
pleasure.
please come back again. I think maybe in the month of May, you said?
Best season in Delhi.
No, but
And come for the full day.
She's very persuasive.
thank you. So please,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
You'll just do a small close dedication. Jojo Senor Bojo. Well, thank you very much.
And some the books.
Oh, sounds good.
So, yeah, we don't have enough for everyone.
Yeah.
A couple of people already asked me, like Joya and the lady next one.
Yeah, we have already some requests for books. I'm sorry we did not order enough maybe, but if you would like to purchase the book, we have copies of Venerable's book by autobiography, I believe. And yeah, they're 600 rupees each. So if you would like one, please come up to me. For those who are first timers here at Tushita, we have a full library in the back where you can check out books for deposit, refundable deposit of 1,000 rupees. So you can check out books, and we also have a store here with malas, seals, statues, and other trinkets where you can purchase. And there's tea and biscuits in the back where you can pick up.
So you have your own.
You misunderstood me.
So available on Audible. It's more effective.
You'll be able to sign.
Yeah, I can do that. So we move these people.
I already have it.
Limited.
This check one.
I'm fascinated by Gurumukhi script, but never mastered it.
Did anyone else request a copy?
Somebody did, but they're not here, so.
Okay.
Session with you on your book. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have been kind of. I've gone through the book, audible. Listen, about you too much in Bihar. If the icon of the Bihar award.
Right.
Really? Sure. I'll write my ID. I'm not always going to respond.
There will be a photograph in a minute, so if people want to stay for a group photo, please go.
Yeah,
That's spontaneous. The journey would like to go on. How about the date?
sure. It is what.
Next. Not funny guys.
Oh, really? Oh. I see. Somebody told me I'm looking more tan. I see. Sure.
Yeah. अच्छा मैं बोल रहा हूँ यार ये उस टाइम Did you go to school?
No, I don't.
Okay.